Contract law. We haven't gotten into the exceptions, and that's what we're going to do today, along with kind of defining a few examples. So with this particular piece of information before you, it talks about some of the exceptions. The idea of detrimental reliance. Here, what we're talking about is an equity issue. We have a circumstance, let's say, in which at least one or more of the elements that are up above this aren't satisfied in regards to the form required by law, meaning it isn't a written contract, or there's maybe some other element that's involved that might be missing. So what we say in regards to detrimental reliance is it falls under equity, and it isn't just, fair, or right to not put the parties back in the position that they would have been in otherwise, except for this. Under equity, we say it's maybe a quasi-contract. It's not a legally enforceable contract under positive law. So with that in mind, we'd say that an individual relied on the other party, and the other party, let's say, doesn't pay them for the particular activity. So they've done something to their detriment. An example could be my 19-year-old. Let's imagine that I tell him if he gets a 4.0 at Purdue this semester, that I will buy him an apple. Oh, he won't do it for an apple. I'll give him $100. Wouldn't do it for $100. But let's imagine I tell him that I would buy him a brand new Corvette. So, not a Corvette. Let's say a Mustang, a GT. 8-cylinder, large horsepower, but not quite the same as a fiberglass car. So with that in mind, now he does what's necessary to get the 4.0, and I don't buy him the car. What's his response? Dad, you breached your contract. Well, under positive law, there is not a contract. Why? Because he hasn't provided me anything of economic value. What do I mean by that? Well, what did I get for promising to give him the car? Not a mustard seed of value. His grades don't provide me any benefit. So with that in mind, we don't have a legally enforceable contract. So under equity, the court would say, did he rely on it to his detriment? Meaning, was he injured because of this, and we'll call it an agreement, this offer and acceptance, because one of the other elements or more is missing. In this instance, consideration is missing. And the court would say, not an enforceable contract under equity if he wasn't injured. Well, let's imagine that he planned on getting a job, or he had a part-time job and he quit that job. With that in mind, the court would say, he relied on your promise to his detriment. He could have made money, at least a mustard seed of value from this. So with that in mind, he's entitled to what? Maybe not the car, but what the court thinks is just, fair, and right. They might give him the car, or they might just say, I owe him a certain amount of money. Could be the amount of money that he would have earned or could have earned during this time, whether it's part-time or full-time type of job. That's the idea of detrimental reliance. Part performance could be that we don't have a legally enforceable contract because I asked someone to, let's imagine, mow my lawn for the next 2 years. It needs to be in writing. Since it isn't in writing, it's not legally enforceable. But the person has mowed my lawn for 3 months, and I've told them that I would pay them quarterly, meaning every 3 months. And they ask for their money, and I say, no, there's no legally enforceable contract. I don't owe you anything. That's correct under positive law. Why? Because it's more than a year in time. So it's not a legally enforceable contract. But the court will say this part performance means under equity, if they argue equity, that it's not just, fair, or right for me to receive his particular services at no cost to me. So with that in mind, what's going to happen is the court will say that I owe him what? The reasonable value of those particular services for those 3 months, not the whole 2 years. Now, if this is a particular company that the individual works for, the company cannot get the profits. They can only get the cost of labor and material. So the wear and tear maybe on the lawnmower, the wear and tear on the vehicle and the trailer that's provided there, meaning the depreciation, the gasoline, the oil cost, the service, what they have to pay the particular individual plus their benefits. That would be under equity, what I'd be responsible for. But if they actually would make 20% profit on that, I wouldn't be responsible for the profit. Why? Because we didn't have a legally enforceable contract, and the court just wants to put the party in the position that they would have, except for this circumstance, this what we will call a quasi-contract or this agreement, because it's not a legally enforceable contract. Now, if you take a look at this aspect, the idea of gift law means that there isn't consideration, which means there isn't a contract under positive law. So gift law requires an intent, delivery, and acceptance. With that in mind, let's imagine that I promise to give you an apple. Remember, we used apples in the prior class. Or I promise to give you a car. I promise to give you something where you're not providing any consideration. Kind of like the example of the car before. But in this instance, let's imagine I tell you I'm going to give you a Christmas present or a birthday present. And then I don't what? Deliver it to you. So we could contend that I had the intent, but since I didn't deliver it to you, you're not entitled to that particular present, even if I've described what it is. Say, oh, it's a chair at Staples. It's the one that costs $425. It'll be perfect to go with your desk. And I'll give it to you for your birthday. And then I don't deliver it. You're not entitled to that. Why? Because there's no contract, there's no breach. If there had been a contract, you'd provide a consideration, meaning a promise to pay me for the chair or some value. Then I breach that, you'd be entitled to your damages. Now let's imagine that I have children, which I do, and I put presents under the Christmas tree, and I tell them they can't open those presents until December 25th. And the reason I might wrap them and put them under the tree early, many weeks before, is try to manipulate them so they're good, right? The idea of being good children. And I tell them that it's a PlayStation 4 that's under the tree or something like that. And so now it's before December 24th, even though the presents are set under the tree, what happens is I decide that I don't want to give them that present. Why? Well, because they haven't been good children. And so before December 25th, I take those presents back and I return them to GameStop, Best Buy, whatever the place is that I bought it from, Walmart, Target. Are they entitled to that PlayStation 4? No. Why? Because the time frame hasn't arrived, which would be the 24th, which would indicate delivery. My intent to deliver it, but I didn't. Now let's change this a little bit. Let's imagine that I offer to give to you that chair, and you say, no, I don't want it. Okay? There's no acceptance. So that works with many circumstances when someone doesn't want the particular gift. We don't have to accept the gift. So let's try this example. Let's imagine that I want to marry someone. I'm already married, but we'll use an example from when I was in graduate school. Let's imagine I asked a particular woman to marry me, okay, and I offer her an engagement ring. Does she have to accept the engagement ring? No. Now, if I hand it to her and she accepts it, that's a delivery and an acceptance. So I had an intent, there's delivery and acceptance. Now we have to be careful with this circumstance, different than other gifts, is this is a conditional gift, the court will say. It's conditioned on what? Her marrying me. So if the marriage doesn't happen, she or I decide we don't want to carry through with this, under positive law, she has to return that ring to me. Why? Because the condition isn't satisfied. Okay. Now, we change that a little bit, and we have some jurisdictions, there's a few, not very many. Indiana follows positive law, but under equity, we have a few jurisdictions that say, no, with that engagement ring, if the man breaks off the engagement, meaning doesn't marry the individual, what happens? The woman gets to keep the ring. If the woman breaks off the engagement, then the man gets the ring back. Why do we do that in a few states? Equity. What's just, fair, and right. Most states don't follow that. They follow what? Positive law. Okay. So this difference that comes into play depending on positive law or equity dealing with particular issues. Now, let's try something else. Let's imagine that we have something like this. Reward for a lost dog. Reward for a lost dog. That sounds kind of different, but not unusual. Let's imagine my dog's gotten out and we can't find it, and I offer a $200 reward for that. Okay? If someone returns the dog, is my $200 a gift? No. Here's how we set it up. The idea behind this is the only time we have a legally enforceable contract is if the party providing the dog is aware of the consideration, in this instance the $200, that's being made available if they can return it. So we call this a unilateral contract. Most contracts are bilateral. All they take is this idea of an offer and acceptance and the rest of the conditions that we talked about satisfied. And we have a legally enforceable contract. You don't have to pay the money. You don't have to receive the goods or services. It's just an agreement with something of economic value behind it. In this instance, if someone says, I'll find your dog, because they know I'm offering $200, we don't have a contract. Performance is what's required. So very few contracts deal with this idea of a unilateral contract. Most all contracts are bilateral. It's this promise for a promise. Unilateral contracts relate to circumstances quite often, other than rewards, where you don't trust the other party. And you don't have, like a PayPal, to be your intermediary that you provide the money to, or they provide the item to. What happens is we're looking at circumstances in which you're not trusting the other individual, so you say you're not going to have a contract unless they perform. So going back to mowing my lawn, rather than a 2-year activity, maybe I ask someone to mow my lawn this week, no later than Sunday at 4. And if I set it up that I'm not promising to pay them, but if they mow it by 4 on Sunday, then we have a contract. What happens now is unilateral. If it goes past 4, there's no breach. So if they were going to mow my lawn for $10 and it cost me $40 to have someone else mow my lawn, under contract law, a bilateral contract, I would have been damaged $30. I was going to pay them $10. I haven't paid them anything yet until they finish the job. The professional person would charge $40 to do the lawn, so the difference is my damage. So they're breaching the contract by not doing the mowing, lets me get $30 from them. If I have a unilateral contract, or trying to set up a unilateral contract, there's no contract in existence until they perform. Then I owe them the money. So businesses, occasionally, if they don't trust the other party, will use the unilateral approach. So the party has to perform. Otherwise, no damages. So what I have now is an example from General Motors. I had a former student of mine whose sister was an engineer, and she had an offer from General Motors. Now, the situation that came up was she was asked to sign all kinds of forms to go to work for General Motors. If you look over this particular part of a contract. It's one element of the contract that they wanted her to agree to. It says it's for 18 months. Okay. Now, if the employment is for 18 months, it has to be in writing because that's more than a year in time. And here's part of the writing that's required. The signature, it's dated, it's signed by the party to be bound. In this instance, it could be signed by both of them. So this, with other things for her to sign, are provided to her as the engineer. She reads over it and sees that it's going to require her to do what? Well, if we enlarge this, we can look closely at what it's asking her to agree to. And what they're wanting her to agree to is that if she doesn't work for them for the 18 months, that she's going to be responsible to pay them $35,000 plus interest. Okay? If she agrees to this, it's a legally enforceable contract. What they have set up, General Motors, is what you can see in this line that's called liquidated damages. That's a term we want to talk about because most of the time we deal with compensatory damages. The court decides what the person should be entitled to because of the breach. We can, in certain instances, change that. If we have circumstances where it's difficult to determine what the actual damages are, then the court will let us put into a contract what we call liquidated damages, what the party would be responsible for if they breach the contract, as long as they're not unreasonable. Is $35,000 unreasonable? Probably not. Why? Because it costs them maybe that much or more to train an individual. And with that in mind, it just has to be unreasonable. It doesn't have to be reasonable. That's the weird part about how the law works. And in this instance, this would be upheld. So this particular former student decided she didn't want to pay the $35,000 plus 8% interest on the money she didn't pay General Motors if she quit within this 18-month time period. So she ended up telling them that she wouldn't accept their offer of employment. That's the idea behind contracts. We don't have to accept a contract. Okay? Now, here's an older one from 2010 when I was selling a home. In this instance, I'm looking to sell a home, but I want to make sure that if the people that are offering to buy the home decide not to buy my home, that I can keep their down payment. Well, if someone gives you a down payment and they're looking to buy your home and then they decide they won't carry through with it or they can't get financing, what happens? Well, if you don't have that as a condition of the contract, meaning a condition requiring them to get financing, as an example, then they breach the contract. And what are you entitled to? Your damages. Well, if I sell this home for the same price or more to someone else, I haven't suffered any damages. So if I haven't suffered any damages, I'm not entitled to any money unless I put a liquidated damage clause in. And it doesn't have to be unreasonable. $5,000 if someone doesn't carry through with the purchase of a home, the courts would say is reasonable. So in this instance, you can see in number 2, it says purchaser hereby deposit with Scott Lynch Realty the sum of $5,000. And then if you look down further, it says it's liquidated damages. We don't have to call it that. We just have to indicate that that is what the party, in this instance the seller, is entitled to if the other party breaches the contract. So liquidated damages become important. Now, let's try another example. Here's one dealing with a government organization, Sallie Mae, looking at merging with another company, and then there's a problem with this merger and it doesn't happen. Well, they call this a breakup fee. And what is it? Almost $1 billion. It's $900 million. Well, what is that? That's liquidated damages. Now, is that reasonable? Well, it's a $25 billion deal just 900 million, the court most likely would say is reasonable. They don't have to agree to that. The court could say it's unreasonable, but it isn't that large a percentage of the actual deal. So with that in mind, let's go and talk about what's normally involved if a party doesn't include this idea of specifying how much you're entitled to. Well, before we do that, let's use another example. Let's imagine you have a home built, or Purdue is building a particular structure. How do you know that the particular general contractor will finish in the amount of time that's necessary for you to be able to move in when you want to? For the university, let's imagine that they've had an 18-month building contract and they want it to be done in the beginning of August so students can start using it that August. Well, they could put in a liquidated damage clause. They could say in the contract, if the general contractor doesn't finish the job by August 1st and indicate the date, then they're liable for $10. That's not enough to make sure they complete it on time. $100,000, $1 million, as long as it's not unreasonable in regard to the construction project, that's legally enforceable. Why? Because it's difficult to determine what the actual damages would be if the students can't move in or can't use that particular structure. So with that in mind, the same thing could happen with you having a particular general contractor build a home. Now keep in mind, they have to agree to these terms in the contract. They might not be willing to agree to the large damage amount. But an example with Purdue, they could say rather than $10 million or $100,000 if you don't finish by this date, they could say every day past August 1st, you'll be required to pay us $10, $100, $10,000, $100,000. That way, it'll encourage the particular party that breached the contract to perform and try to get it done as soon as possible rather than just a lump sum. So there's different ways to set up these liquidated damages. Even faculty have those particular things. If they go on sabbatical and they don't stay for most universities 2 years after they've had a sabbatical, the contract, the policies usually require them to reimburse the college or university the costs that were expended on them. What's that? Wages and benefits. So the school then can receive those back from the particular party. Now, the idea of dealing with a traditional breach. Let's imagine that I have a Diet Coke that I want to buy. And you offer to sell it to me for $1. And then I say, yes, I accept. Bilaterally, that's an enforceable contract. It doesn't have to be in writing. Genuineness of assent, we know what a Coke is, a reasonable person would, and we know what $1 is. Consideration, something of value, the Diet Coke. The dollar is worth more than a mustard seed of value, and it only has to be a mustard seed. Okay, so I'm competent, you're competent, we don't have any problems with legality, and it doesn't have to be in writing. Even though it's a sale of goods, it's not $500 or more in value. So with that in mind, we have a contract. But if you don't deliver to me the Coke, Diet Coke, for the $1, what happens? You breach the contract. If I have to go someplace else and get that Diet Coke, let's say down the hall, and it costs me $1.50 to buy the Coke, what are my damages? Well, I haven't given you the $1 yet. Yet it's a bilateral contract, it's legally enforceable. I don't have to have given you the $1, just the promise to give it to you. And so with that in mind, if I have to pay $1.50 and we'd contracted for $1, my damages are 50 cents. Change that a bit. Let's imagine that I could buy the soda in the vending machine for 75 cents. I'd have to pay you $1. Now I have no damages. I'm 25 cents ahead. That's how it works. With that in mind, I'd mentioned last time specific performance. It's a particular way where we look to equity rather than positive law. Under positive law, if there are damages in regards to contracts breach, the party is only entitled to monetary damages. Under equity, we can get what we call specific performance if the item or thing is unique. Okay? So what's unique? Can a Diet Coke? No. But let's imagine it's a painting, a Rembrandt. And let's imagine that you are now a chief executive officer of some major Fortune 100 company, and you have more money than you know what to do with. And you offer to buy a Rembrandt that I hypothetically own, and let's imagine you offer to pay me $10 million for it. Well, if the Rembrandt is appraised for $12 million, and if we have a legally enforceable contract, in this instance it's a sale of a good, so it'd have to be in writing, $500 or more, so we have a legally enforceable contract, and I decide that I want to keep the Rembrandt or sell it to someone else for more money. Excuse me. I breached the contract. What are you entitled to? Your compensatory damages are $2 million. But let's change this example. Let's imagine, like I said, you have more money than you know what to do with. You really want this particular Rembrandt, so through our negotiations, you've agreed to pay me $14 million. The actual fair market value is only $12 million, but to you, because you want it so badly, you're willing to pay more. It's kind of like going to Disneyland or Disney World. You're really thirsty. Let's imagine there's a vending machine. Rather than the dollar or the $1.50 for a soda, it might cost $4, $5, $6, right? That's not illegal. You can pay more than the normal fair market value for a particular item. So you're willing to give me $14,000. We put it in writing, legally enforceable contract, and I change my mind. I don't want to sell it to you. Now, have you been damaged? Under positive law, the court, if you sue me, would say no, you're not entitled to anything. Why? Because you were paying more than what it was worth. So they would say you haven't suffered any monetary damages. So now we move from this aspect of positive law to equity. So rather than asking for monetary damages, because a Rembrandt painting that's one of a kind, it's unique, it's not mass manufactured like this particular soda or a textbook, you can ask for specific performance. And if the court doesn't think monetary damages are adequate, in this instance they're not, then they can issue an order that I deliver to you that Rembrandt. And if I don't, I'm in contempt of court, meaning I can go to jail because I haven't complied with the court order, and they will send deputy sheriffs to seize that painting and deliver it to you. Now, you will have had to pay those monies into the court. So I'll get the $14 million and you'll get the painting. So that's what we mean. Now, let's imagine we want to take it a bit further. Your textbook talks about this idea of duress. Okay? So, as you can read, the contract that deprives the victim of free will. That's what we're looking at. So in this instance, we might look at duress, and certain types of duress make a contract illegal. Okay? Physical duress. Here I'm defining what physical duress is. Let's open this up so you can see it a little bit better. It makes the contract voidable, meaning the victim has the right to get out of the contract. So if I'm holding a gun to a particular person's head and I tell them that they have to buy my particular painting, it's not a Rembrandt, it's a painting I painted, for $14 million because they have more money than they know what to do with. And it's really not worth very much because it's something I painted, right? That's physical duress. And so that's voidable at their option, right? So they can get out of that contract. I can't get out of it if they decide they want it for that $14 million. Now, economic duress can be used. In many instances, though, the court will say that it's a legally enforceable contract unless it deprives the person of free will. Why free will? Because an offer has to be voluntary in nature and an acceptance has to be voluntary in nature. So if it's such an extreme circumstance that it deprives one of the parties of their free will, the courts do have the opportunity to invalidate that particular contract. Okay? Now we take it a step further and we say, fraud. The idea of false statements, the idea of reckless indifference in regards to the truth, basically lying, misrepresentation, or fraud is what we're talking about. And with that in mind, it's in regard to a contract. So if I'm trying to sell you this Diet Coke for the $1 and I've already drank it, now empty, I have my hand over the top, and we have a contract for you to buy it. You think it has Diet Coke in it. I just finished it off. So a reasonable person would think for $1 they're entitled to a full soda. Now, I could have told you it was full also. Either way, I'm trying to defraud you. With that in mind, the court will invalidate the particular contract and not require you to give me the money, or in this instance, for me to hold you responsible for my damages. Okay? So one of the ways to get out of contracts is through this aspect of fraud. Now, written contracts, that's a situation, if all of the elements of a written contract are there, the court will say, we will only look at the four corners of that particular contract, meaning one page or thousands of pages, and that's what we'll use to interpret the contract. We won't let you testify, verbally explain what the contract meant. We look at the contract, the court will say. The exception is if there's some type of fraud, misrepresentation, or deception, then the court will let oral testimony come in, meaning let you talk about what the words mean, what you'd agreed to, but that's only if there's fraud, misrepresentation, or deception going on. And then the court will let in what in law we call parole evidence, which is just a verbal testimony by one or both of the parties. Now, what I have in front of you is what we call a contract of adhesion. Okay? This just means that one side has too much power. It's a take it or leave it basis. Now, in many instances, the courts will say it's a void contract. But even though it's an adhesion contract, it has to be unconscionable, meaning against public policy, extremely detrimental to the party that's forced to take the contract before the court will say it's void, meaning no legally enforceable contract. Because we have contracts of adhesion all the time. If we go to buy insurance and we're not a large corporation, we either have to take what their terms are or go to a different seller of insurance. Same idea with colleges. We can't really negotiate. It's a take it or leave it basis. So with that in mind, as long as it's not unconscionable, meaning under equity, unjust, unreasonable, then we'll be bound to that contract if all of the legal terms are there, meaning our elements that we've talked about. Now, let's try this. Let's use this as an example. Again, I'll make it a little smaller so it'll fit on the whole page. But the idea behind it is quite often we sign contracts and we don't really read them. And this is just one page, but you might have multiple page contracts that you look at entering into to buy a home, a car, something like that, or online where you agree just by choosing that you accept the terms, something that you haven't read. But in this particular example, we have a party that's going to let someone play paintball, meaning shoot other people with these hard paint pellets, and they're not accepting any of the liability. So what they're trying to do is eliminate some of their potential monetary damages. Okay? With that in mind, as long as it's not unconscionable, the courts will enforce these contracts if they satisfy the particular terms. In this instance, dated, signed by the party to be bound, meaning you, if you want to do paintball, and if you're underage, You have to get parental consent. Why? Because this isn't a necessity of life, and a minor is incompetent, meaning under the age of 18, so they can get out of this contract within a reasonable time upon turning 18. So if they're not 18 yet, even if they're injured, they don't have to accept this, even though they've signed this particular thing. You and I, over the age of 18, we can be held liable as long as it's not unconscionable, meaning against public policy, too inclusive. So something like this, we agree to the particular terms, we can be held liable. We see that all the time. Purdue does it for individuals that want to study abroad. They have a particular waiver form that requires individuals to sign and basically not hold Purdue liable by contract if they're injured in regard to study abroad programs that Purdue has provided for them. So with that in mind, we have this aspect of contract law.